Hello everyone and welcome to my definitive video on the film Oppenheimer. I first watched this movie in theaters when it came out, obviously, and from that first viewing, Oppenheimer quickly became my favorite film ever made in the 21st century. On the surface, it is a biographical look at Oppenheimer's life, but as you dive into the narrative and the techniques used within it, it becomes so much more. And so a few months ago, I began doing a series of videos talking about all the many things that stood out to me about this masterpiece. And so here I have compiled all of my videos that I've done on the subject into my definitive work on the film Oppenheimer. The reason that I'm doing this is because as of when I'm recording this video Friday, I am in the process of getting ready to move back home. I moved out here to try and start something on my own, find a job, and just, try and get my start on my own. But unfortunately, it hasn't worked out that way, which is totally fine. But that does mean that I am extremely busy this week with the moving process and getting settled in back in my home in Alberta. So I couldn't do a video for you all this week, and so that is why I am posting this. And so I hope that you stick around, and I hope that you enjoy the many things that you can look forward to in this video. I explain why I think the movie changes back and forth between black and white and full color. I dive deep into the pure technical marvel that is this movie. I use my whiteboard to diagram the entire narrative of this film and explain why I think it is the perfection of the Nolan narrative. And we also discuss the cultural and mythical implications that this film and its source material had. And these are just some of the many things you can look forward to in this video. So with all that said, let's get into the video, starting with my initial thoughts on Oppenheimer, having seen it at that point 3 separate times. As I just stated, Oppenheimer was directed by Christopher Nolan. It is his 12th film he has made, and it is a 3-hour-long biopic of the historical person of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer himself being a very famous physicist who is most known as the father of the atomic bomb. This film was released in the summer of 2023 alongside Greta Gerwig's Barbie film, sparking the very popular Barbenheimer trend. In my notes, I wanted to give a brief summary of the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer as an intro to this video, and what started off as a very quick summary of his life ended up turning into a very detailed, very comprehensive, and very long list of research into his life and his achievements. So I'm just going to briefly summarize all of the stuff that I wrote down. Also, in talking about Oppenheimer's life, I am going to be spoiling some events that are shown in the movie. So if you haven't seen it yet and don't want it spoiled for you, then I would skip to this timestamp, and that way you'll be safe from any spoilers. Following the work of Albert Einstein on general relativity, Oppenheimer went to study theoretical physics in Europe. And from there, he went on to do some very impressive work in general relativity and quantum field theory. After studying in Europe for a time, he took his knowledge and his practices and brought them over to America to start his own American school for theoretical physics. And during his time in America teaching theoretical physics, he co-authored several papers that were essentially pioneers in this new field. Their specific area of focus in these papers was on what happens to white dwarf stars when they collapse in on themselves, and this led to the theoretical discovery of what would later be known as black holes. And in 1942, Oppenheimer was recruited onto a very special project called the Manhattan Project. This project was tasked with one simple goal, and that was to build an atomic bomb before the Nazis did. At this point in time, with the research that physicists had put into the concept of nuclear power and nuclear energy, it became very quickly apparent that one could utilize this energy to build a bomb. And with World War II at its peak, the chief concern was that the Axis would be able to build an atomic bomb before the Allies. Oppenheimer was selected to head the project, and a central laboratory was made in the deserts of New Mexico called Los Alamos. This is a nuclear research facility that would remain in operation long after Oppenheimer's tenure there. In July of 1945, they conducted the Trinity test, which was the first ever successful detonation of a nuclear device. This was an event that Oppenheimer later recalled in an interview in 1965, wherein he cited the Bhagavad Gita when he quoted saying, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds."
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
I sure hope I said Bhagavad Gita right. If you say it with confidence, then people will believe you. After this successful detonation, 2 atomic bombs were given to the US Army from Los Alamos, and those were the bombs that were dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And after this point, he dedicated his life to informing nuclear policy going forward. For a while, he was chairman of the advisory committee on the Atomic Energy Commission, which was created shortly afterwards. It seems after the detonations at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he became incredibly fearful of the world that he had potentially created in inventing this device. And so he used his status as the father of the atomic bomb to inform policy and hopefully ensure that nuclear war would never be a possibility. However, there were many in government and the Atomic Energy Commission who wanted bigger arsenals. Their fear was if Russia, who was the big opponent at the time, were building up arsenals, then the only way to safely combat this was to have a large arsenal of their own. And so to remove Oppenheimer's voice from the equation, they brought up some events in his past in order to discredit him in front of the US government, particularly old ties to communist parties in America. See, this was during the Red Scare and the McCarthy era, so there was nothing that the US public and government feared more than communism. So his US security clearance was revoked, he lost his seat on the Atomic Energy Commission, and from there his public voice was largely stifled out. And from this point on, he largely disappeared from the limelight, only giving a few public speeches and making a few public appearances. He received some recognition, but nowhere near the level of recognition and fame that was associated with him before. And in 1967, having smoked his entire life, he passed away due to throat cancer. His life is very interesting and very tragic, but this is the life that is explored at length in Oppenheimer. The purpose of this video is this is going to be my review of Oppenheimer, my thoughts on Oppenheimer, both spoilery and non-spoilery, because in the coming weeks, I'm going to be doing more videos on Oppenheimer, whether it's the narrative structure that Nolan utilizes or some theories that I have coming out of the film. But this video is just to lay the groundwork, give you my thoughts on Oppenheimer as a whole, and my honest opinions on the movie itself. And I want to make it very clear, this video is going to be full of bias, and that bias is, I love this movie so much. This is my favorite Christopher Nolan film of all time. I don't claim to have seen all of Nolan's work, I've seen the majority of it, but I would say that this is the culmination of his entire career as a director. All of the traditional hallmarks of Nolan's style of filmmaking are brought to full realization in this film. And Christopher Nolan aside, the film Oppenheimer, I would argue, is the best film of the 21st century. At least so far. We've got a lot of century to go. So with that said, I hope that you stick around and I hope that you enjoy this review of Oppenheimer. For the channel, this is kind of a nostalgic return to that series Film Student Reviews I did a while back. I can't even call it Film Student Reviews anymore because I'm not a student anymore. I guess filmmaker reviews? Director review? I don't know. This is just going to be a review of Oppenheimer from someone who knows at least a little bit about what they're talking about. So maybe you've seen the film already, but you came away confused or have a lot of questions. Maybe you don't plan on seeing it and you're just searching the internet for other people's opinions on the film. Maybe you're like me, and hearing someone talk about a subject or a film very passionately will inspire you to go see it for yourself. And whichever one of those best describes you, this video is going to lay the groundwork for a series I'm going to do on Oppenheimer going forward on so many different aspects of the film. So I hope that you'll stick around for this series. Whatever the case may be, thank you so much for watching, and we'll get into the video very soon. But first, a word from our sponsor. I'm on a mission to make content creation my job, and to do that, I need your help. In the description, there is a link to my Patreon where you can support me in exchange for benefits, as well as a link to my Twitch channel where you can support me through subscriptions and bits, as well as a PayPal if you're feeling generous. Thanks for listening to my speech, and we're gonna get back to the video. So the title of this video was correct. I have seen Oppenheimer in theaters 3 different times. This is something that just I as a person never do. If I go see a film in theaters, I only see it once. But my experience with Oppenheimer was so good, I had to see it 3 different times. The first time I went to see it, it was a normal digital screening of Oppenheimer. Me and a friend that I was going to see the movie with made the mistake of trying to look for IMAX tickets the day before we went, which was a bad idea. So we ended up having to go to the digital screening. And that first experience was phenomenal. I was blown away by the filmmaking, the cinematography of this film, as well as the soundtrack. The soundtrack was so impressive to me. And I'll get into detail on all of these things that I'm talking about either later in this video or in later installments of this series, so don't worry. And the story itself was very compelling and provoking. This film had a stacked cast, and all of them gave amazing, incredible performances. And the second and third times that I watched Oppenheimer, it was in IMAX 70mm film. For anyone who doesn't know, this film was released in an analog format, having been shot on film originally. Due to Oppenheimer's extensive runtime and the large format that is IMAX 70mm film, the final reel of Oppenheimer was 11 miles of film, and each reel weighed 600 pounds. And for the select theaters capable of projecting this movie on film, these 600-pound spools of IMAX film were delivered to these theaters, which would all be screened using an analog film projector. And not only is it authentic film, but IMAX 70mm is the largest screen format ever devised. And so my first experience of watching this film in IMAX 70mm, because this was also the first film I'd ever seen in that format, was incredible. It was the largest screen I had ever seen. Even sitting in the back of the theater, I was still craning my neck to get a view at the full picture. The picture dominated the entire wall of the theater. And you could also tell that what you were watching was projected from a spool of film. There was the light flickering of the frame, because film is just a series of frames passing very fast by a light source. And occasionally artifacts like hair and spots would appear on the picture, which gave it that authentic film look. It truly was a very special experience, especially in the modern digital age, because I didn't grow up watching films like this in this format. So the first time I watched it was in digital, and I was still blown away, but I was blown away several times stronger the second and third time watching this absolute masterpiece in IMAX 70mm format. But with all of that said, now I'm going to get into my non-spoiler thoughts on the movie as a whole. See, as the title suggests, this film is about the life and experience of Oppenheimer first and foremost. In fact, I don't think any movie has done such a great job of being 100% in the mind of its character that I've ever seen. Did that sentence make sense? I have no idea. There are many films that capture the subjective experience of a character, but this film lived and breathed in the life of Oppenheimer. It was so totally and completely his. And being a film about his life and his experience, that is the central focus of the film. While the story does talk about the bomb itself at length, much more time in the movie is spent on Oppenheimer and his thoughts and feelings during the whole thing. And when the bomb does finally go off, very little time is spent on it afterwards. While the explosion is very impressive and very well done, after it detonates, the film then refocuses on Oppenheimer. So if you're going to watch this film looking for a movie centered around the bomb, if you just want to see like a glorious explosion and that's what you came for, while I will say you will be satisfied with the explosion when it happens, you might be disappointed with the film as a whole because very little screen time is given to the bomb. The majority of this film is about Oppenheimer. I feel like I keep repeating myself. These notes are probably the least structured notes I've ever used for one of these videos, so I apologize. But when the bomb does go off, it's incredibly satisfying. The sound design is incredible. The bomb was created using practical effects, and so when you're watching it, you are witnessing a real explosion. Not an atomic explosion, obviously, but a very real explosion. And as Nolan promised, I practically felt the bomb when the shockwave hit. It was very intense. It was a terrifying and strangely beautiful moment in the film. The other thing to note is this film is a combination of a biopic, a historical drama, and a courtroom drama. And thus, most of the film is talking, which I really enjoyed. I loved watching the story unfold through characters' dialogue with each other. It was very compelling to me, but this may not be compelling to someone who is expecting a lot of action from this movie. And of course, another big thing to bear in mind is that the film is 3 hours long, which is very intimidating considering most of that is talking. And I can totally understand why people would find that boring. But personally, I didn't think it was. Every scene that is shown, every dialogue that is had in the movie has its importance in the story. And the story was far too interesting for me to call it boring. That's really all I can say about this film from a non-spoilery standpoint. So from here on out, this is going to be my spoiler review of the movie. My thoughts on the movie that contains spoilers. So if you don't want to see spoilers for the movie at this point, even though it's been out for a few months now at this point, I would skip either to the end of the video or just stop the video here. One thing I really enjoy about this film is Nolan's use of the setup and payoff in his narrative. And that takes the form of certain shots that are seen and certain sound effects that are heard throughout the movie. We'll be given part of a shot at one point in a film only for us to see the resolution of that shot at the end of the film. Or there's a sound effect that we hear at different points in the film, but we don't know what's causing it or what's making that sound until later in the film. This is a technique that Nolan has used before in the past, but in Oppenheimer it has a very real, very visceral impact. At least it did for me. For example, when we have really tense scenes about people at a table discussing the inevitability of nuclear war, Oppenheimer will start to stare dramatically into the camera and we hear this stomping sound fill the room around us. And as we find out, that stomping sound comes from a horrible moment in his life where he was forced to get on a stage and give a speech to people who were stomping and cheering for him as he gave a speech about how his device was used to kill hundreds of thousands of people. Before we get this resolution, the stomping is inherently very tense. But once we see who was making the stomping and the context for when the stomping occurred, it really drives the point home. He is terrified of the world that he's made, but the people still celebrate him, and he's horrified of that. We also see throughout the film these horrible visions Oppenheimer would have of the future that he potentially created. Shots of nuclear arsenals, rockets shooting into the sky, stuff like that. And all of these shots that we only see part of throughout the movie are then paid off at the very end in the very final beautiful scene of Oppenheimer. The final scene itself is a masterpiece. It is just a close-up of Oppenheimer's haunted face as he is tormented with visions of what he believes his legacy will be. In this sequence, all of the shots that we have seen throughout the film are shown in full, and it's meant to terrify us. I also love how the soundtrack of this film traces the character's journey. I don't know why I said character. Oppenheimer was a real person. The last time I listened to a soundtrack that so accurately traced not only the character's thoughts and emotions, but the journey that the character is taken on and the conflict that he encounters, it was when I listened to the soundtrack for The Joker. And I know that movie has largely been ruined nowadays by the Sigma community, but I stand by The Joker being a good film. Even if you just listen to the two tracks, Can You Hear the Music and Destroyer of Worlds, you get a sense of Oppenheimer's full character journey. Can You Hear the Music is a fantastic track that sings about the dreams and nightmares of this starry-eyed young scientist. This is who Oppenheimer was at the beginning of the film, a young scientist full of optimism and wonder for the world around him. And at the end of the film, in the final scene, Destroyer of Worlds plays. Both songs had the exact same melody, but Destroyer of Worlds is in a minor key. This perfectly reflects the jaded and terrified scientist that Oppenheimer is at the end of the film, as he fully believes that he may have unintentionally doomed the entire world. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this film was Robert Downey Jr.'s portrayal of Louis Strauss. I thought he made a very compelling villain for the story, and Strauss's story in itself was very interesting. When he first met Oppenheimer, it was when he first arrived at Berkeley. And even then, that original scene when the two are very cordial and very friendly to each other, we see glimpses of Strauss's ego put on display. We don't know that he's the villain at that point. In fact, we think that he's a supporting character for Oppenheimer. But looking back on the film, you can see that they were laying the groundwork for his arc as the villain, even in that first scene. And in that first meeting, he walks in on Oppenheimer and Einstein having a conversation with each other. And when Einstein walks away and Strauss tries to greet him, Einstein gives him the cold shoulder. This is the crux for his arc as a villain, and the crux for the conflict that Oppenheimer finds himself in the movie. Strauss believed that Oppenheimer somehow poisoned Einstein against him, and so he held on to that resentment until finally it boiled over into him trying to undermine Oppenheimer so that his own agenda could be fulfilled. And of course, there were a few other humiliations that Strauss received at the behest of Oppenheimer, but this was the crux of his whole issue with him. He's a very effective antagonist in this film, particularly because you don't initially realize that he is the antagonist. Like I said, this is the start of a series on Oppenheimer where I'm going to go far more in depth into different aspects of Oppenheimer, the film, that I really loved and really enjoyed. But I believe that those ideas deserve their own separate videos because it felt wrong to sandwich them into a very long video where ideas may be glossed over. And so all of that to say, this is not my final word on Oppenheimer. There will be future installments of this series where I talk more about different aspects of the film. But in closing for this video, I want to bring up my one minor qualm with the film as well. I've sung this film's praises for this entire video now, and I believe it's well deserved. This is, as I've stated, I think the greatest film of the 21st century, but I do have one small issue with it. See, this film is full of very famous people, both famous actors in the modern age, as well as famous historical characters in the movie. And some of the treatment around these characters, like entrances into a scene or cameos in a scene, play off a lot like a cameo in a Marvel movie. I can't explain it better than that, but sometimes a character will be given like a dramatic entrance into a scene that feels very weird. Like there's a moment where Oppenheimer's getting dropped off at home, and when the car pulls away, it's revealed that Einstein is standing right behind the car. It's weird stuff like that. And of course, there's the moment at the very end of the film where Strauss is denied his application for Secretary of Commerce. This is kind of his big like defeat at the end of the movie, where like he discredited Oppenheimer and ruined his life, and now that's come to light, and now he in turn is being kind of like rejected. And when he asks who the votes against him were, one of his aides says that one of the people who voted against him was this young upstart senator who's trying to make a name for himself. And the dialogue kind of goes like, well, what's his name? Kennedy, sir. John F. Kennedy. Like, I don't know. It feels like a Marvel movie. And there's a few more examples too. Like I said, this movie is stacked with famous people and famous historical characters as well. And considering that's my only issue with this film, that's not a big issue. So with all that said, that is this week's video, which is my comprehensive overview of my thoughts on the film Oppenheimer. And so those were my initial thoughts coming out of the film 3 separate times. And after this, I did loads of research into the specifics of what shooting an IMAX 70mm really means. And I did more research into the score and how it came to be. And so now let's dive into why, on a technical level, I believe that Oppenheimer was a revolutionary film. I'm gonna start by going over the soundtrack that was made for this film, because the development of the soundtrack began even before they had begun shooting the film. The score was made by composer Ludwig Göransson, who is a very new name in the Hollywood sphere. He is most known for his work on The Mandalorian, both Black Panther movies, and of course Christopher Nolan's previous film, Tenet. And according to Ludwig, about 2 months before the shooting of Oppenheimer began, Nolan called him directly and asked if he was available the next day to read a script that he had finished. This, of course, was the script for Oppenheimer.
As soon as I read the script, I'm putting the pieces together in my mind.
They had their first meeting, and for the next 2 months, Ludwig began feverishly producing music for this film. He has said in interviews that he was producing roughly 10 minutes of music per week, and then at the end of each week he would meet with Nolan and they would go over the material he had made. He would present the music to Nolan and they would spend that time kind of refining the instrumentation and refining the direction of the music.
The film score grew very organically and very gradually from the smallest elements.
And he's also said that before Nolan went to start shooting the film, Ludwig sent him about 3 hours of music that he had composed for Oppenheimer so that Nolan was able to fully immerse himself in it for the duration of the shoot. Whenever there was a break in filming on set, he would listen to this music to kind of recenter himself on the emotion and the spirit of the film. And of course, these were not the final cuts of the tracks that we are able to enjoy today. And once the movie was done shooting and rough cuts were assembled, they were able to refine the score into what we know and enjoy now. And you can tell watching this film that Oppenheimer is one of those movies that was incredibly influenced by the music.
We would take his experiments and we would put them to picture and edit them and try different things and show it to Ludwig, and he would go and bring more things to the table.
It is the emotional center of the film, and there are so many examples of sequences in the movie that were edited, and you can tell they were edited with the soundtrack in mind. Now, one of the main inputs that Nolan gave Ludwig in terms of a direction for the soundtrack is that he thought the score for Oppenheimer should be rooted in the violin as a core instrument.
I had no preconceptions about the music for the film. Sometimes you have an idea for the soundscape of the world or the rhythm of it, and sometimes you don't. And in this case, all I had that I gave Ludwig was the idea of basing the score on the violin.
And in its own way, this makes sense. Not only is Oppenheimer a big historical figure, but he was also a scientist. He was an intellectual and an academic. There is a whole montage at the beginning of the film during his studies in Europe where he is exposing himself to this revolutionary new movement in science of the quantum realm. And this montage includes shots of him observing the postmodernist movement of art unfolding around him. This montage is meant to create the feeling that Oppenheimer is a pioneer. He is part of the new wave of scientists exploring the new wave of science. And the montage is meant to give you that feeling. And so when devising a score for this sequence and many other sequences in the film, it is rooted in the violin, and the instrumentation almost has a classical sound to it. He is an intellectual who moved around in the circles of high society. And as such, the soundtrack for the film has a very strong classical feel to it. Even when Ludwig utilizes elements of synthesizers in the track, it still feels very orchestral in its make. The synth almost sounds like the distillation of an entire brass section into one unified sound. That paired with the violin instrumentation creates a very organic and very impactful sound. And now for all the music nerds in the audience, I want to go over just a few of my favorite tracks from Oppenheimer, go over maybe the technical aspects or their contribution to the film as a whole. Starting off with the most recognizable piece from the film, Can You Hear the Music? This track begins at 75 beats per minute, or BPM, and every 4 measures, the tempo increases. The result is by the end of the track, the tempo is nearly 3 times faster than when the track initially started. And to bear in mind, the majority of the instrumentation for this track is the violin, so the violinist would have to successfully play this for a recording. This is a piece that Ludwig thought would be impossible to play, and so the original plan was to record 4 bars at a time, or 4 measures at a time, and then stitch it together. However, it was his wife, a notable violinist herself, that insisted that they try and play the piece as one continuous recording. The recording process for this track alone took 3 days, and for reference, the track itself is not quite 2 minutes long. The piece consists of these endlessly cascading, arpeggiating violins, and they are finally joined towards the end by a dark, gliding synth that underscores the track. Can You Hear the Music in and of itself is a monument to music, and the composer and the orchestra who recorded it. This is the track that underscores the montage I was talking about just a little earlier. But now for another track with great significance in the film, Destroyer of Worlds. And I want to talk about this track in relation to the last one, Can You Hear the Music? I briefly mentioned this in my overview video on Oppenheimer, but I want to reiterate it here. Can You Hear the Music and Destroyer of Worlds are, musically speaking, the start point and the end point of Oppenheimer's character journey. The instrumentation is exactly the same, but Destroyer of Worlds is performed in a minor key. Oppenheimer starts his journey as a young scientist filled with wonder for the unseen world around him. He is a starry-eyed scientist eager to explore the vastness of the universe, and Can You Hear the Music reflects that awe and wonder perfectly. But at the end of the film, he is just a shell of himself. He is very jaded and very disillusioned with the world around him, and above all, he is terrified of the world that he believes he has created. He believes that the world that he helped to discover may end up being the cause of humanity's destruction. And Destroyer of Worlds reflects this terror back at the audience. These two pieces together are a distillation of Oppenheimer's entire character journey, a journey that takes just less than 5 minutes to listen to. And the final track that I want to mention in this video is Ground Zero. This track contributes to the mythical nature of the film, which is something that I'm going to talk about in a future video. But to give a brief explanation, the film itself is based on the biographical novel about Oppenheimer entitled American Prometheus. And even the very beginning of the film gives us this message about Prometheus and how he gave fire to man and was punished for an eternity for his insolence. And I'll be talking about this more in depth in a future video, but the film Oppenheimer as well as the novel American Prometheus, they both place Oppenheimer in this mythic tradition. The scope of his achievements and their consequences are larger than life. And this film, particularly in its score and in its sound design, is placing Oppenheimer in a tradition of gods. And the track Ground Zero is a perfect example of the mythic nature of this film and of his achievements. The track plays when the construction of the bomb is complete and they are preparing to conduct their first ever test of this new weapon. This score emphasizes the dark nature of the bomb and the consequences that it will have. It is almost made to sound like the heartbeat of a demon or some old god. This is no mere bomb. This is the culmination of knowledge that humanity was never supposed to know or possess. What they in the film are about to do will irrevocably change the course of human history, and almost certainly for the worse. It is a sobering track because we are witnessing a retelling of a series of events that led to decades of fear and paranoia that persist until this day. The score in itself not only is a film in and of itself, but is a monument to the creators who made it and to the film that it exists in. And now for this video where I talk about the feat of filmmaking that is Oppenheimer, I want to talk about shooting in IMAX 70mm film. You see, Christopher Nolan at this point has a very extensive background shooting with IMAX film. For the longest time, their film cameras were used primarily for feature-length documentaries, and that's basically all that they were used for. But then in 2007, Nolan became the first filmmaker to use IMAX film cameras for a non-documentary film called The Dark Knight.
He kind of invented this idea of shooting in IMAX for feature film, and so you're kind of on the cutting edge of this stuff every time you work with him.
The film was largely shot on Panaflex Millennium XL film in junction with Platinum cameras, but roughly 28 minutes of the film's total runtime was shot with IMAX 70mm film. And since then, he's kind of been their unofficial spokesperson almost for the use of IMAX 70mm. With the exception of his film Inception, all of his subsequent films following The Dark Knight were all shot, at least partially, using IMAX 70mm film. And as a matter of fact, the ambition of Nolan's films has led to advances in technology with IMAX 70mm film. With Interstellar's runtime of 2 hours and 50 minutes, IMAX needed to widen the size of their film platters, as no film of that length had ever been shot in this format before. So of course, with Oppenheimer having a runtime of 3 hours, they had to do the same thing and continue to push the boundaries of their film platters. Because I didn't know this until I did the research, but 3 hours is the absolute longest that an IMAX 70mm film can be. With our current technology, no 70mm IMAX film could ever exceed 3 hours. This Oppenheimer literally pushed the boundaries to their absolute limit. And through the course of this film, they also had to develop their own custom black and white 70mm film, as no such film stock existed before this movie.
We were able to test large format black and white, put it up on a giant IMAX screen and have a look at it, and the results were just magical and inspiring.
Nobody had ever shot a black and white film, or black and white scenes at least, in IMAX 70mm, and so they had to create their own film from scratch. And now to go on a rant about the film itself, because IMAX 70mm is the largest screen format available, period.
15 per IMAX 70mm is the highest quality imaging format that's ever been devised.
Specifically in the business, it's called IMAX 1570. This refers to the 15 perforations that go above and below each individual frame of IMAX film that are used to anchor it in its projector. And 70mm refers to the fact that a single frame of this film is 70mm tall. This format is 8.3 times larger than 35mm film.
That's conventional 35mm. We shoot on 70mm. The other format we use is 70mm IMAX.
Most movies that are shot on film use 35mm rather than 70mm. For additional reference, this is a Canon F1. This is a film camera that was developed in the 70s, and this shoots on 35mm film. And each individual frame or exposure of 35mm film is roughly that big. And IMAX 70mm has an aspect ratio of 1.43 to 1. For reference, most YouTube videos that you watch have an aspect ratio of 16:9, and most movies you watch are either 1.85 to 1 or 2.39 to 1. 70mm film stock is fed through horizontally, whereas other film stock is fed vertically. So when you've seen depictions of film cameras that have the vertical film spools on top of it, the film is fed through the camera vertically, but with IMAX 70mm, it is fed through horizontally. And now I'm gonna geek out briefly about the resolution of IMAX 70mm, because it blows my mind.
It gets thrown up on a gigantic screen, and the moment you watch it, it's very evident. The quality is unprecedented.
See, IMAX digital cameras, in terms of resolution, usually max out between 2K and 4K. 4K being the resolution of the video that you're watching right now. Films that are shot on IMAX 70mm but viewed in a digital format can have resolutions as high as 6K. But viewing an IMAX 70mm film in one of the few theaters that is designed to play movies in IMAX 70mm film, you can be experiencing resolutions of up to 16K.
It fills your peripheral vision. It immerses you in the image. The clarity, the crispness, it is the gold standard. It is the closest to reproducing the world the way that your eye sees it.
That is baffling to me. And for the people who are shooting on IMAX 70mm, not only is it a large format, but it is also a very cumbersome format. See, take a look at these pictures of how big a single frame of 70mm film is. And now think of the equipment that it would require to film a scene using this film. And with shooting using a mechanical rather than digital medium, there are a slew of errors that can occur. Maybe the film gets damaged, maybe it gets overexposed, maybe it gets caught within the inner workings of the camera itself and rips. It's not only an inconvenience to shoot an IMAX 70mm film, it is a chore to film in IMAX 70mm, which is why when someone does decide to shoot a film in this format, it is very likely that this is a passion project. And so for that, I want to thank Nolan and the entire production crew for choosing to shoot in IMAX 70mm, because viewing the film in that format in one of those select theaters was a genuine privilege. And above all, probably the biggest thing for me that I find very beautiful about Nolan's use of 70mm in this movie is its counterintuitive use. I've discussed now at length just how large the physical format of IMAX 70mm is, especially in terms of physical space and its resolution. The final reels for Oppenheimer were 11 miles in length, and each spool weighed 600 pounds. This format is the literal definition of scale in cinema. It is probably the closest experience one can get in filmmaking to the experience of the human eye. And this film was originally used for feature-length documentaries, likely showing a sense of scale and size of whatever they were capturing. But despite all this, Nolan uses 70mm film in Oppenheimer to tell a very close and a very personal story.
IMAX is a format of spectacle, and it's made for vistas and for the grandeur of it. But I got very curious to discover this as an intimate format.
And while there are, of course, the occasional grand sweeping landscape shots in this format, and it's beautiful, the majority of these shots in the film are used to tell a very close and a very intimate story.
Our film tries to take you into his experience, and IMAX for me is a portal into a level of immersion that you can't get from other formats.
Most of the shots in this huge 1.43 to 1 aspect ratio are close-ups of Oppenheimer and the people around him. We are able to view the emotions of these characters from extremely close in a resolution that is almost akin to the human eye. The result is a level of immersion in the life and experience of Oppenheimer that literally cannot be replicated outside of the 30 theaters worldwide that showed Oppenheimer in this format. Nolan took the largest and most grandiose format of cinema imaginable and used it to tell the close and personal story of one man. And I think that's something really special. And if you've stuck around this long, hopefully you think that it was special too. And if you're here at the end, I just want to say what's up, gamers? It's your boy Vin the Vlogger here, making a surprise cameo. How you doing? Hope you're doing good. I'm just working on editing the video that you are currently watching, but I thought I'd do this little segment because it is Wednesday, November the 21st. And for all you gamers out there, you know that that means that the Oppenheimer movie, the film, is out on DVD and Blu-ray. And so we're gonna go pick that up right away. Also, here's the video. I'm working on it right now, like I just said. Da Vinci, shout out. And for anyone wondering what I do while I'm editing these videos that you watch every week, I usually just have Wendigoon playing in the background. I generally, I hit my webcam. I generally just I edit my video, but I also got Wendigoon going in the background because it's nice background noise while I edit. So that's the scoop. I'm not gonna film or vlog while I'm driving because that's dangerous and you shouldn't do that. So we're just gonna cut right to the shot of me picking up Oppenheimer in Walmart because I got some other things I need to grab too. So here's that shot. Bag secured. Hey gamers, so I ended up going back actually and getting the 4K UHD version of Oppenheimer. No, I do not have a 4K UHD Blu-ray player, but this does come with the normal Blu-ray as well. And later down the road, if I do get a UHD Blu-ray player, not now, but later in the future, I would love to have this movie in that higher resolution because I don't know, this movie is very special to me. I don't know if you couldn't tell from the fact that I'm making so many videos about it, but this movie is very special to me. And so I wanted to have it in the highest quality that I could. Are those sirens? They surely are. They are. Also, sorry about the low lighting. It's getting dark. It's not quite 4:30, but yeah, so that's why I got the 4K version, because this film means a lot to me, and down the road when I do have something that can play that higher resolution, I would love to have a copy with that resolution. As I was editing that video, I did end up buying the movie physically because physical media is, of course, dying out at this point. and I just love the movie so much that I wanted to make sure I had a copy for years and years to come. And so now let's dive into my big theory coming out of Oppenheimer, and that is to answer the question, why does the film choose to switch between black and white and full color throughout the picture? And how does that pertain to the actual narrative that is unfolding? While the story of Oppenheimer is not in and of itself a mystery, there are certain production choices that we are meant to question as an audience. And the biggest one that you can come away with is, why did Nolan choose to shoot this movie in both color and monochrome? And for anyone who doesn't know, black and white is called monochrome. I'm just gonna say monochrome because it will save time. And I've heard many good theories as to why Nolan took this visual approach to the film. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to lay out the theories that I've heard for why this is. I'm going to give some arguments in favor of this theory, and at the end I'm going to speculate for myself on what I think the true creative reason was. Of course, I can never know that. I don't know Christopher Nolan personally. We are two different Chris's in two different calibers. So with that said, let's get into the first theory that I've heard. The first theory that I heard is that all scenes shot in full color are purely a subjective experience of Oppenheimer's reality, where we are viewing the world around him and his own thoughts through his own head. And by contrast, all of the monochrome scenes are meant to be an objective look at Oppenheimer's life, kind of detached from his own personal thoughts and reflections. So in short, full color is subjective reality and black and white is objective reality. Now, I heard this theory before I watched Oppenheimer for the first time, and so for the whole movie, I was looking to see if this theory was correct. I was testing the theory in real time as I watched the movie. And from what I saw and what I experienced, this theory absolutely holds up. Not only does this theory work, the colored reality being Oppenheimer's experience and the monochrome being an objective look at Oppenheimer, but there's also a dialogue happening between the two realities as you watch the movie. The monochrome reality would ask a question about Oppenheimer's life or speculate on a decision that he made and why he would do that. They question his motivation, and then the color reality would then answer that question for us through backstory. The monochrome reality is removed from Oppenheimer's life and doesn't understand his motivations or his reasons for the actions and decisions that he made. But the color reality is Oppenheimer's raw thoughts and emotions projected onto film. And while this color reality isn't actually verbally answering the questions for the audience or for the monochrome reality that is speculating on his life, we as the audience begin to understand his motivations and the answers to the questions that they are asking in the black and white reality. So this theory does absolutely hold up. However, there is another theory out there, and that is that these two realities, the black and white and the color reality, represent the stories of two different characters. And that would be the characters of Oppenheimer, the protagonist of the film, and Louis Strauss, the antagonist of the film. I didn't really talk about this in my review of Oppenheimer, but Louis Strauss was the former acting Secretary of Commerce in the United States. And he was also a part of the Atomic Energy Commission, while Oppenheimer was also a part of that organization. And in the film, he is portrayed to absolute perfection by Robert Downey Jr. He is the one who essentially orchestrated a kangaroo court for Oppenheimer in order to revoke his security clearance and discredit him publicly. He had Oppenheimer labeled as a communist sympathizer so that his anti-nuclear policies could be ignored, because Louis Strauss was of the opinion of nuclear expansion and growing the US's arsenal in order to compete with Russia. And so one theory goes that the colored reality, again, is the experience and the life of Oppenheimer, and the black and white reality is the reality of Louis Strauss. And this theory also makes sense. I was talking before about how the color and the black and white realities could represent subjective and objective reality. And in a way that is still true, because Strauss doesn't know the experience and the emotions of Oppenheimer, so any speculations that he has as to Oppenheimer's character are removed from the person of Oppenheimer. And so, in a sense, both theories are true. And no matter which theory you stand by, either way, Oppenheimer's story, the color reality, is still the raw, unfiltered experience of Oppenheimer. It's just a matter of whether you assign a character or a person to the objective reality of monochrome. And there is another way that we can speculate on the use of color and black and white, because this is not the first time that Nolan has used this exact trick. He has done that before in a previous project of his, Memento. And just to give a quick summary of Memento for you, it centers around a character who is suffering from amnesia, and he is spending the film trying to put together the pieces of life events that led him to where he began the film. And in that film, the color reality is moving forward in time, trying to piece together the events of what happened, trying to uncover the story ahead. Meanwhile, the black and white, or monochrome reality, was reviewing the events of the film in hindsight. And the two perspectives converge at the same point at the end of the movie. And the result of this is a full experience for the audience. They get to watch the same film but through two different lights. And both of these perspectives converge at the same point at the end of the film, resolving all questions that each previous reality asked. And Oppenheimer basically does the same thing, although a bit more nuanced. And so to talk about what I'm going to talk about, I need to go to the whiteboard real quick. I hope you all can see this. This is the entire timeline for the film Oppenheimer. All of the events that take place within the film take place between the years of 1924 and 1963. 1924 being when Oppenheimer was studying physics in Europe, and 1963 is his reception of the Enrico Fermi Award. I hope you all can hear me. And these other points, this timeline isn't to scale, by the way, at all, just so you know. These other points are the major core events of the film. That is the Trinity test in 1945, a conversation that took place between Oppenheimer and Einstein somewhere between the years of 1947 and 1953, Oppenheimer's Security Council meeting in 1954, in which his security clearance was revoked and he was labeled as a communist sympathizer, so this was that, and a Senate hearing held for Louis Strauss in 1959. I'm going to attempt to draw this in real time, by the way. Now, the colored timeline, which is Oppenheimer's perspective on the events of the film, begins here at his Security Council hearing, and all of the events that are shown in the film are his recollection of the events from that point in time. So we're going to draw a line that goes here, and then events are shown from his study onward in a linear fashion. This looks terrible, I'm going to redo it. Meanwhile, the black and white reality of Louis Strauss is looking at the events of Oppenheimer from here, his Senate hearing. This narrative looks at some of the events in Oppenheimer's life from the Trinity test onwards. So we're going to draw an arrow to here, and this is the time frame that the black and white reality takes place in. And the two narratives, the two timelines, converge here on Oppenheimer's conversation with Albert Einstein. This event was first seen at the very beginning of the movie from Strauss's perspective in black and white. But at the end of the movie, we see this conversation unfold in full color from Oppenheimer's perspective. So this conversation between Oppenheimer and Einstein is the start point and end point of the film. It is both the inciting incident and the conclusion. For the whole film, the black and white reality is trying to solve the question, what did Oppenheimer say to Einstein in this conversation? It is the question that drove Louis Strauss mad and is one of the many reasons that he distrusted Oppenheimer and tried to have him discredited in the eyes of the US government. And then finally, at the end of the film, we realize that Oppenheimer and Einstein weren't talking about Strauss at all, and it's his own ego that made him assume otherwise. This film, Oppenheimer, is the perfection of the Christopher Nolan narrative formula. All right, we're going to put this down now and talk about another thing. Now, of course, these are only theories, and we can only speculate on the true purpose behind Nolan's use of color in black and white, but he does give us one clue as to what this motivation was, and that is that he uses text to label both of these realities. At the very beginning of the film, we are given subtitled text for the colored reality and the black and white reality. The colored reality is labeled number 1, fusion, and the black and white or monochrome reality is labeled number 2, fission. And these labels are shown on screen when we are given our first look at Oppenheimer and Strauss. And for those of you who know a little bit about nuclear physics and know where this is going, this makes the dichotomy of the two characters very interesting. You see, when attempting to create nuclear energy, the two processes that can be used are nuclear fusion and nuclear fission. Nuclear fusion is the process of fusing atoms in order to produce energy, whereas fission is the splitting of unstable atoms to create energy. And this gives us our big insight into the difference between Oppenheimer and Strauss. It is apparent that both of these people believe themselves to be larger than life. They both possess very massive egos in their own way. Oppenheimer was an egotistical scientist with a god complex, and Louis Strauss was a control freak who wanted to climb the ladders of power in the US government. Strauss makes the claim in the film that if Oppenheimer had the chance to go back and do it all over again or undo the invention of the atomic bomb, he would do it all again because he loved the attention that it gave him. And perhaps he's right. So these are both inherently flawed people with very inflated views of themselves, but the main difference is the people that surround them. Despite Oppenheimer's personal flaws, he is surrounded by compassionate and confident people. His wife stayed by his side for their entire lives, despite the numerous affairs that he had. He may be known as the father of the atom bomb, but he was surrounded by a team of brilliant and capable scientists who helped to bring the machine into reality. And when the time came for his Security Council hearing, his loyal friends stayed by him because they genuinely cared about his reputation and him as a person. Fusion requires multiple atoms in order to spark a reaction and produce energy. And in the same way, Oppenheimer is the hero of the story because he is surrounded by confident and capable people who care about him and elevate him to that level. Strauss's main flaw, and the reason that he was ultimately unsuccessful, I believe, is because he was alone. Sure, he had aides in the Senate hearing who tried to help him, but Strauss went behind their backs to try and undermine due process. He did this in an effort to save his own skin, acting in self-preservation. This move backfires and is one of the many things that led to his downfall. Just as fission is achieved by one unstable atom splitting itself, Strauss failed as a villain because he had no one in his corner. In his instability, his life's work fell apart, and he has no one to blame for that but himself. And this is the meaning behind Christopher Nolan's use of color in Oppenheimer. And so that's my big theory as to why the narrative bounces between black and white and full color in Oppenheimer. And now finally, we come to the mythical and cultural implications of this movie and how Christopher Nolan, through this film, is placing Oppenheimer in a mythic tradition that goes back millennia. This video was inspired by a conversation that I had about the movie with my brother. My brother is an aspiring author who is going to school to get a degree in creative writing. We are both storytellers at heart, but while my focus tended towards the medium of film and video, he tended towards the written form of writing and books. And so we're going to get into something that I find very fascinating about the origins of the film Oppenheimer and the implications that it has for not only the story as a whole, but for our culture as a whole. So with all that said, let's get into the video. See, when I was having this conversation with him, I brought up the title for the book that inspired the film. And when I did, he visibly leaned forward in his seat. You see, the screenplay for Oppenheimer was inspired largely by the biographical book American Prometheus. And in naming the book that, this provides the reader with a clear narrative goal that the book has. It is directly comparing the story of Oppenheimer to that of Prometheus, the Greek titan who gave fire to mankind. Even the film Oppenheimer at the very beginning alludes to this comparison. And this is where my brother's insight into what this means came into play. You see, there are many philosophies around literature and the stories that we tell. One popular one is that there are only 7 types of stories in the world, and any narrative that you can find across books, movies, or whatever medium will follow one of those 7 types. And another philosophy, one that we discussed in relation to this film, Oppenheimer, and the book that inspired it, is the idea that all character journeys can be summed up with only 3 types. The first is the archetype of the hero's journey. Now, there are many steps to this kind of a narrative, but here are the basic elements that are required to tell a hero's journey story. It begins with the hero being called to adventure, and in accepting this adventure, he crosses a threshold that begins his character arc. He then faces challenges and external pressures, which lead to him reaching a very low point. And from there, he learns to rise above the evils and begins the process of transformation and atonement, having conquered these evils. And then, having conquered these evils, the hero returns home, concluding the story. As you can tell from the footage I inserted, one very famous example of the archetype of the hero's journey is that of Luke Skywalker in the original Star Wars trilogy. The next is the redemption arc. While the hero's journey usually follows the journey of a moral character, the redemption arc covers the journey of an immoral character. This character usually starts off with an immoral goal, and then their weaknesses are exposed, forcing them to confront themselves and their beliefs and morals. Then they must respond to the repercussions of their own weaknesses by either working through it and finding redemption, or by being overwhelmed by that weakness. The conclusion of this arc is their response to their actions towards redemption and the responses of others to this character's attempt to seek redemption. Going along the same theme, this can be seen in the character of Darth Vader in the original trilogy. And finally, the third character journey archetype is the fall from grace. This is essentially the redemption arc, but in reverse. This arc starts with a character at its peak. They have it all. Then you identify a weakness or multiple weaknesses in their life. Then this character encounters a series of events that specifically play on that flaw. The character's actions lead to dire consequences that rapidly escalate, and in the aftermath of this fall, it is important to witness the character's response to these events. This ultimately results in the character being forced to confront the consequences of their actions. The final step is the character having to deal with this new state that they are in. And a great example of this is Anakin Skywalker in the prequel Star Wars trilogy. And this philosophy of the 3 types of character journeys is important because Oppenheimer's story in real life, in the book and in the film, is a real-life fall from grace. And in our modern Western society, which is heavily influenced by Greek and Roman culture, the pinnacle of the fall from grace archetype is and has been for thousands of years the story of Prometheus. This is what inspires that comparison. And in doing research into the myth of Prometheus for this video, I came across other parallels that I find quite interesting. So I hope you'll indulge me in this little tangent. See, in the original myth, the Titan Prometheus was first and foremost a craftsman and a sculptor. In some versions of this myth, Prometheus is credited with creating the human race by forming them out of clay. And when he looked on humanity, he saw that they were weak. In their desperate struggle to survive, there was little time to advance their society. And so, taking pity on them, he resolved to steal fire from the gods, which had been strictly forbidden by the chief god of the Greek pantheon, Zeus. And so, in secret, Prometheus came to humanity and taught them the secrets of fire. He also gave them knowledge of craftsmanship and metallurgy. For the Greeks, Prometheus existed at the very center of science and culture. Obviously, Zeus saw what Prometheus had done and decided to punish him, and for his punishment, Prometheus was chained to a rock for all eternity. And every day, Zeus would send one of his eagles to tear out Prometheus's liver and devour it. His liver would then regrow so that it could be devoured the next day. Now, for context, in ancient Greece, it was believed that the liver was the center of human emotion in the body. So if the myth had been written in modern times, or had the Greeks had modern knowledge of anatomy, then in all likelihood the eagle would rip out Prometheus's heart every day. In the Greco-European context, Prometheus is the definitive fall from grace story. And then thousands of years later, in the 19th century, there then came another culture-defining fall from grace story. And that is the story of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or as it's known by its alternate title, The Modern Prometheus. And there are definite similarities between these two stories. Victor Frankenstein begins his journey as a very eager student of science, with a particular interest in the older, more archaic forms of science. And for the Greeks, Prometheus was the foundation of science. And so in naming her book The Modern Prometheus, she is placing Victor Frankenstein in the tradition and in the practice of Prometheus in the sciences. Frankenstein is his spiritual successor, both in his spectacular accomplishments and his spectacular fall. Overcome by hubris and a desire to play God, Frankenstein used these archaic sciences to give life to an abominable creature, this patchwork of bone and muscle and flesh. And through this act and his creature's actions, he brings about the deaths of everyone that he had ever cared about. His punishment is to watch helplessly as the creature he created dismantles and destroys his life and everything he ever loved. In a metaphorical sense, the monster rips out Frankenstein's heart, just as Zeus's eagles rip out Prometheus's heart, or rather his liver, every day. While the setting and characters are different, Frankenstein is put through the very same fall from grace that Prometheus had. And then, in the real world, in the 20th century, a real-life fall from grace was experienced. Both in the film, in the book, and in real life, Oppenheimer's journey follows the same path as that of Prometheus and of Frankenstein. He was a man of science, which already puts him in this same cultural tradition that dated all the way back to Prometheus. And like Frankenstein, Oppenheimer had aspirations of becoming a legend in his field. Specifically, he wanted to become a pioneer of this new quantum world that Einstein had discovered. In his mind, I believe that he wanted to become Einstein's successor and unlock secrets in this new quantum world that would put him in the history books. Now, as I've said, in any good fall from grace story, the character needs a fatal flaw. Just a warning, I'm going to be talking about Oppenheimer's life as if it were a narrative. I know objectively that he was real. Obviously, I cannot speak to the mind of the real Oppenheimer, but in the film, I believe that his fatal flaw was a deadly combination of hubris and naivete. He took on the Manhattan Project because he wanted the prestige and the glory that came with it. His spoken rationale for creating the atom bomb keeps changing throughout the film, but his unspoken rationale, I believe, is that he always wanted to be the next Einstein. And this weakness was all the motivation he needed to push forward and build the first atom bomb. The high point of his hubris comes after the successful detonation of the bomb at the Trinity test, where he is received with the praise and adoration of his peers, just as he always wanted. But this was a short-lived moment because his actions had very real consequences. Almost immediately after this success, at least in the film, 2 more bombs are shipped out of Los Alamos that were then dropped on Japan. And from that moment, everything that happens is completely out of his hands. Him and his team are the people who devised this creation and who cheered at its success, but now they are powerless and can only watch and listen for what their creation is used for. The military got what they wanted, and they could now produce as many bombs just like it as they wanted, and Oppenheimer was no longer needed. And then decades later, Louis Strauss's own ego would compel him to destroy Oppenheimer's credibility in the public eye. And with this, Oppenheimer completes his fall from grace and joins the lineage that began with Prometheus and was continued with Frankenstein. And as Einstein warns him, he must now face the consequences of his achievement. The film Oppenheimer is fantastic, and one of the many reasons I believe it is the mythic connotation that this film has. I'm now just realizing this is going to be a very short video. Honestly, that's fine. That's probably for the best, actually. Inspired by the book American Prometheus, Nolan made a film about a man who walked the path of giants. A man whose legacy, for better or for worse, will shape the destiny of humanity. And this film does an excellent job at depicting the gravity of these acts and the consequences that they have. And above all, it firmly establishes Oppenheimer's life and legacy in a tradition that has lasted for thousands of years, as he takes his place next to 2 bastions of knowledge, whose ambitions and intellect became their undoing. An unholy trinity of the father of Western science, the man who gave life to a creature destined to take life, and the inventor of a device that could be used to destroy humanity. And this is the mythic implication and cultural impact of Oppenheimer. And there you have it. This is my definitive work on the film Oppenheimer. It is without a doubt in my top 3 greatest films of all time, as well as, in my opinion, the greatest film ever made in the 21st century. I remember seeing a quote from someone, I can't remember who, saying that Christopher Nolan will be one of those directors that decades from his time as a director, he will be remembered as one of the greats of our generation. And I would have to agree. No one else does quite what Christopher Nolan does. It is a style that is unique to him, and it is a style that is groundbreaking every time we see it. And so I hope I was able to do the film some justice, and I hope that you have enjoyed my commentary on the movie. On the video. I almost said on the video. As you watch this video, I am currently getting settled in back home, but I hope that I will be back next week for another great video for you all. And of course, a huge thank you, as always, to my patrons, Sean, and the top tier patrons, RD and Snowy. Thank you so much for supporting me for this long, supporting the content, and supporting my dream of doing this for you all full time. And I hope that I never run out of these phenomenal stories that I come across that I can't wait to share with you all. But with all that said, thank you so much, of course, for watching, and I will see you all next week, hopefully, for another great video. I hope that you're all excited for that because I know that I am. And cut.